How trees grow and why they grow where they do are influenced by many factors. The physical characteristics of the location or site, the unique characteristics of the species in question, their interactions among other trees and plants, and their interactions with animals. We need to touch upon these various ecological factors so you may become better acquainted with the ecological process of plant succession. Plant succession is probably the most important concept you will learn in this short course. It drives how your woodland changes over time. With that change come changes in the animal communities that call your woodland home. And you need to understand how you, or your natural resource professional, can reset this ecological clock to meet your land management objectives. So welcome to Forest Ecology 101. Site characteristics include soil, topography, and climate. The soil environment can be broken down into soil depth, texture, and fertility. Generally, deep soils are better than shallow soils for tree growth because they potentially have a greater nutrient supply and water holding capacity. Tree roots absorb nutrients and moisture in the top 24 inches of the soil. Tree growth will be affected where bedrock, coarse gravel, a hardpan layer, or excessive moisture restrict root development. The depth of this effective root zone can change dramatically within a very short distance. These two soil pits lie within 200 feet of each other. The effective root zone in the left soil profile is in excess of 4 feet, while the profile on the right has an effective root zone of only 18 inches. Soil texture refers to the size of the soil particles. Particles are classified by size as sand, silt, or clay. Sand particles are relatively large, silt is moderate, and clay particles are very small. Soils with a high proportion of sand have large pore spaces between the soil particles. They tend to be dry because they quickly absorb and quickly drain water. Clay soils have a high water holding capacity, but they are slow to absorb water. Also, water adheres so tightly to the clay particles that very little is available to tree roots. Soils with a high proportion of silt are most favorable for water absorption and holding capacity. Soil fertility is based largely upon the type of underlying parent material from which the soil originates. Some of the most fertile soils originate from limestone, shale, and windblown deposits. Some of the least fertile soils originate from sandstone and granite. Generally speaking, clay and silt soils have a greater nutrient supply than sandy soils. Topography affects tree growth because of its influence on soil depth and available moisture. Because gravity pulls soil particles and water downhill, soil depth, nutrient supply, and available moisture are usually greater on bottomlands and on lower slopes than side slopes. Hilltops are usually somewhere in between. The exception to this general rule of thumb are the river hills along the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, where fairly deep and rich soil can be found just about anywhere. Aspect is the direction the slope faces. It influences the amount of sunlight and consequently soil moisture available to trees. North and east-facing slopes tend to be cooler and moister than slopes that face south and west. This is because the sun is slightly to the south in the northern hemisphere and does not shine directly on north aspects. East aspects receive the direct sun in the morning before the heat of the day. Less direct sunlight and morning sun lead to less water use by trees, hence moister soils. By the same token, south and west-facing slopes receive more direct sunlight and hence tend to be hotter and drier than the other aspects. Aspect is easily discerned in aerial photographs, particularly photographs taken when the leaves are off the trees, and the low angle of the fall and winter sun accentuate the hills and valleys. Here in this photo, the south and west-facing aspects are lighter in color compared to the softer shadows of the east and north-facing slopes. The particularly dark shadows running parallel to the river in the upper right indicate very steep north and east-facing aspects. Aspect effects become exaggerated as the steepness of the slope increases. Sites with steep slopes tend to erode more easily, dry out faster, and are more prone to fire damage. Climatic factors directly affecting tree growth are sunlight, temperature, and precipitation. Seasonal temperature and precipitation patterns determine the general forest cover type and species present. As we'll see in a minute, Sometimes it is not the amount of precipitation, but the kind of precipitation. Important tree species characteristics start with seed production and germination habits. For example, plants that are the first to colonize bare ground are called pioneer species. Cottonwood and sycamore tend to produce large amounts of lightweight seed that can be carried on the wind in search of such sites. Seedlings of species that cannot stand competition, such as cottonwood, yellow poplar, and shortleaf pine, tend to exhibit fast growth rates in an attempt to gain the upper hand. Other more accepting species like sugar maple and hickory have slower growth rates as they bide their time waiting for the moment when competing vegetation is removed. There is not only tolerance to competition, but tolerance to drought and flood. For example, shortleaf pine is tolerant of the droughty conditions of south and west-facing slopes, but very intolerant to the flooding typically encountered in bottomland sites. The natural resistance of a species to damaging agents, both living and non-living, can also come into play. Short-needled shortleaf pine tends to withstand snow and ice storms better than its longer-needled cousin, loblolly pine. White oaks are not as susceptible to oak wilt and red oak borers as species in the red oak group. Lastly, the expected lifespan of a species can play a significant role in the health of your woodland. A prime example of this are the thousands of acres of black and scarlet oaks throughout the Ozarks that are over-mature. Their excessive age has led to reduced vigor and increased susceptibility to oak decline. The interrelationships among trees are mainly concerned with the competition for available resources. Like all plants, trees need sunlight, water, and nutrients to grow. Sunlight is required for photosynthesis. Photosynthesis translates to food, and food translates to growth. On most sites, sunlight is the most limiting factor to tree growth. Since a tree cannot get up and move if it finds itself growing in a shady spot, it must either be able to tolerate that shade or a disturbance is necessary to change the amount of available sunlight. These gaps in the canopy can be created naturally when a tree dies or by cutting neighboring trees. Species differ with respect to their tolerance for shade and are classified from very tolerant to very intolerant. Those that are very tolerant will reproduce and grow beneath a dense canopy. Intolerant species will survive only if they sprout in openings with full sunlight. Most commercial tree species have at least an intermediate rating. Therefore, competition for sunlight is a big factor. Water is required for growth activities. Competition from grasses is usually worse than competition from other trees, particularly when planting trees in old fields. For example, while tall fescue is a good pasture grass, it is extremely detrimental to the growth of black walnut. On dry sites, moisture is a greater limiting factor to growth than sunlight. As mentioned earlier, aspect greatly influences available moisture. As with most agricultural crops, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and calcium are all important for normal plant growth and development. But in most natural forest systems, nutrients are not the limiting factor to growth. As this competition plays out, the forest develops several structured levels. Each level is a part of the same plant community. The topmost level is the overstory, made up of dominant and codominant trees such as oaks, hickories, and ashes. For the most part, these trees are either completely or partially shade intolerant and require abundant sunlight. The second level includes the understory trees. Some of these trees are actually suppressed members of the dominant species found in the overstory. For whatever reason, these trees were left behind as the forest matured. Other trees belonging to this level are the shade-tolerant species, such as maple, pawpaw, and flowering dogwood. The third level is composed of woody shrubs, such as gooseberry and buckbrush. It also contains seedlings of the overstory and understory trees. But because of the intense competition for available resources, these individuals eventually die. In most woodlands, this layer of native species adds a richness of diversity enjoyed by humans and wildlife alike. However, invasive, non-native species such as autumn olive and bush honeysuckle are becoming an increasing problem in natural forest communities. They are outcompeting good wildlife food sources such as the gooseberry. Plus, they are inhibiting any remaining available sunlight from reaching the forest floor, so no regeneration of any new tree seedlings is possible. The fourth level consists of ferns, wildflowers, and other herbaceous plants that blossom in early spring before leaves emerge on the trees and shade out the sunlight. The final level is the forest floor itself. This carpet is made up of decomposing plants and trees and the decomposing organisms such as fungi. While seemingly insignificant, this level plays a crucial role in recycling nutrients back into your woodland.